Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of our 2020 GC3 Virtual Roundtable. My name is Michelle Jalbert, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of the GC3. For those on this call who don't know us, the GC3 brings together more than 125 companies spanning the entire value chain, all working together to accelerate the commercialization and adoption of green chemistry. We're delighted that you could join us today to learn more about our work. Our first order of business is to thank our sponsors. We are very grateful to our host sponsor, BASF, for their support of this 6-week event. They immediately came forward when the pandemic hit and helped us shift to this virtual platform to bring the GC3 Roundtable to you. We also appreciate the support of the sponsors of our 3 overarching themes: innovation, collaboration, and commercialization. Dow, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, Lego Systems Incorporated, and RB are longtime GC3 members, and we appreciate their support of our innovation series this week. Today, we're examining a cutting-edge topic: digitalization for sustainable innovation. So what does this mean? Isn't most of your life digital these days? Of course it is. The question is how to apply all those technological advances to the work that we do. What tools can we use to enhance collaboration and innovation in sustainability? Those are the questions, and we've got a great group of speakers to discuss the possibilities. You received their full bios earlier this week, so let me just highlight names, titles, and affiliations. Today as speakers, we have Jill Becker, CEO of Cobotics, David Entwistle, Head of Process Chemistry, Codexis, Greg Montello, Head of Product Chemistry, New Balance Athletics, Bourré Molinar, Global Digital Product Line Manager at Cargill, Brian Cholsu-Standen, Head of Digitalization and Materials and Chemicals, R&D North America, BASF. Julie Manley, our Director of the GC3 Startup Network, will moderate the discussion this morning. Julie?
Thanks very much, Michelle, and I'm really excited to be moderating this session today. We have, as you just said, an amazing group of panelists representing multiple sectors, which is really the groundwork of the GC3, cross-cutting across sectors. So when preparing for this, I was giving it some thought, and I started thinking, actually, maybe surprisingly, but in a really nice way, I thought about my mom. My mom is actually was a math major in college, and her first job was actually working for IBM at what became my local hospital. So I was not even a glint in my parents' eye at the time, but I was later born at that same hospital years later. So working for IBM, my mom worked in the computer room at the hospital, and as she always emphasized, the computer was the room, and at the time she was a systems engineer. And over the years, as computers got smaller and smaller, my mom would always remind us where she used to work and the size of those computers. So my mom, looking back in a way, was at the forefront of digitalization so many years ago. And for the sake of all of us today, I am not going to say how many years ago that was. I'd like to keep some of that information private. So clearly, digital data is nothing new. But the question we actually are going to be working on today is how companies are strategically integrating digitalization for sustainable innovation. There are so many ways to manage, utilize, and leverage data to drive efficiency, optimization, new product markets and applications, transparency, and so much more, while at the same time minimizing material and energy use, creating safer reaction conditions, increasing transparency along the supply chain, and optimizing design for circular economy. And I'm sure that's not the end of it. So next slide, please. With all of this data, there's an enormous opportunity to capitalize on the interconnectivity across segments of the business, across companies and sectors. So one of the examples presented today is actually going to be related to transparency through the supply chain. So there'll be more talk about that as we go. Next slide. And finally, as we go through the day, we will also explore the future opportunities for digitalization and sustainable innovation. In some sense, one might think that the amount of data incorporated into these future decisions might in fact be able to minimize some risk. So I don't want to steal our panelists' thunder or their time, so let's get right to it. Today's session, from a format perspective, so you are all aware, will actually be broken down into several segments. The first is going to include BASF, Cargill, and New Balance, briefly highlighting digitalization at their respective companies. We'll then take a short Q&A, and then we'll also return with Keybotics and Codexis to share their experiences as companies that are incorporating digital technologies to enable their core businesses. So again, this will be followed by a brief Q&A, and then we're going to re-engage all of the panelists for today in a larger group discussion. So with that, with a series of Q&As throughout, please submit your questions into the questions box at any time. When you have the question, just send it in and we'll see how to incorporate it throughout. So with that, I'd like to ask Brian Standen from BASF to turn his mic and webcam on. And then I will take a step back. Brian?
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. I hope you're all hearing me okay and can see me well. I'm really excited to be here today and really appreciate the opportunity to share some of this cutting edge work that we're doing in how digital meets sustainability. As mentioned, I work for BASF and my title is Head of Digitalization and Materials and Chemistry R&D in North America. And I also wear a second hat, which if you see this image might give you a little bit of an idea of what that might be, but I'm the global head of next generation computing. And what that means is we're actually exploring new computing architectures. And that image that you see on screen is a very highly imagined concept of what a quantum computer would look like, sort of the insides, because in reality it's just a big tube. But if you could give me the next slide, what I'd like to do is get you at least some sense of what we do from an R&D perspective and how we think of digitalization and our approach to it in general. And then I'll get a little more specific about how this applies then to an approach to sustainability. And so we think of this in 4 discrete areas: data science, scientific modeling, knowledge solutions, and lab process automation. Within data science, we break this down into both the analysis and the data management, because you can't have one without the other. In scientific modeling, we're thinking about molecular structures. We're thinking about interactions at that level. And we're also thinking about atomistic design of molecules and how that works, and process development. Knowledge solutions is very much about how we look at the world both outside of BASF from an information perspective, but also how we look at ourselves internally and how we can take those two things and put them together in order to create knowledge. And the last area that we think about a lot, of course, is lab process automation. How can we automate the acquisition of data? How do we go about doing that? And even over time, how can we automate the labs to do the work for us? Next slide, please. So thinking about how these digital technologies and what we do in the labs and at BASF, how we can apply this. And so we think of this broad concept of the Internet of Materials, probably not a foreign concept to you, maybe it's new. But the idea is really, if we think about this grand vision of how we have all of this data and how we can share it about materials, could we actually then help not only in how we develop materials across companies, across business units, as was mentioned earlier, but also how can we benefit from that in a circular economy? And so this really requires much more information, but it also requires not just information about the materials. For example, the Materials Genome Initiative has actually done a really nice job of collecting a lot of this data already. So some of that data is out there, but there's more to be learned and more to be put together into that database, including information on things like automation or information of sensors, and how you create the infrastructure for that data exchange and what that would look like. Next slide, please. So a couple of examples that I'd like to share with you just briefly to give you some sense of how we then try to think about these big visionary ideas and how we can bring them together is a very sort of fundamental one where we actually created a circularity challenge that we hosted with Greentown Labs out of the Boston area. And we looked at multiple areas of possibility, right? Circularity by design. So how do we design in the way we actually create our products? How do we improve by processes? But just as much, we emphasized enabling tools, right? And that's where we see that digital plays a very significant role. It's part of our corporate strategy, not just for R&D, but overall. And so this was a key element to what we would try to actually bring in for people who would be a part of this particular challenge, which was a series of startups, and we would fund them through the Greentown Labs incubator. And so here we have different types of possibilities for how digitalization can impact sustainability, both from simulation or cross simulation or tracking. IoT is another good example, looking at contaminants or thinking about new business models, right? The digitalization actually can create for new opportunities. Next slide, please. Another example, and I think this is sort of the more tangible example, right? We have competition, so that helps with collaboration, but here we've actually released a way of doing this. We call this ResiChain. This started as a pilot in Brazil and then has now turned into a larger pilot in Canada. And it's really about how we can utilize a technology like blockchain to work our way through the circular economy and the life, excuse me, the lifetime of a material, right? And so here you can see that in this circular approach, as opposed to the linear approach, which we all understand, each one of these that are black circles that are numbered are actually part of the blockchain. And that means that's part of the digital enabling platform to help make this happen, which can create transparency across these areas between suppliers and ourselves, for example, or additive manufacturers. And so that's one way I think in which we were actually trying to address the challenge, and one way in which I think digital helps to enable new ways of providing this type of transparency. Next slide, please. And that's all I have. So I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction and say hello, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate that. And if you'd like, you're welcome to take your webcam off and mic, and we're introducing Bore. This is perfectly seamless, and I will step back. Bore
Awesome.
from Cargill, thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Nice, thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to speak a few minutes on what Cargill's doing in sustainability regarding innovation and digitalization. And before we jump in, I think that the big thing, the why of why Cargill is doing this is a little bit different because we're an agricultural business. And the big topic for us is how do you create trust with something physical like food, and how do you digitize some of that? Because in a modern world, they are to some degree connected, but in a lot of ways also disconnected. So I have a practical example a little bit where I'd like to dive into to show you guys a little bit about what we're doing. Next slide, please. And you can animate the next few tiles, that's okay, thanks. So the digitalization, why is it key for sustainability? Well, we have a pretty big and complex supply chain because we have soy, palm, cocoa, beef, and many other product lines in Cargill that are operating at a global level. And our market is very diverse. We go from food retailers to food manufacturers to food distributors. And effectively, our puzzle to solve is around traceability, transparency, productivity, and sustainability. Feel free to animate those. And I think one of those key elements is that for us, traceability is really about the verification and the proof of something that we did historically and today in something that is happening in our supply chain. Transparency is really about our ability to be open about what we do, and there's different technologies at our disposal to do some of these things. I think what it's really about Cargill's position here is to say we're taking accountability, but we're also seeking others to play in that space as well. And productivity always feels like a lens for us to say that feels efficiency driven. That is actually not the case. We're really focusing from a sustainability perspective that we're ensuring and directing the right investments towards initiatives like farmer livelihood and other things, but that we can also see the investment come to yield, and then that we can also prove that back into the top two tiles. And all of this is at the core of sustainability. We want to make sure that we don't deplete natural resources of which we source our raw materials and ingredients. Next slide, please. So if you think about the space as sustainability, and feel free to add those tiles as well as you load them up, thanks. So there's 5 main areas that we're targeting, for example, in today's cocoa chain, palm or soy. And you see here a bit of a picture in the background. This is actually in Ivory Coast, where a farmer is being audited. Sounds heavy, but we're doing a survey here. And one of the key components is, as we engage at a local raw material level, is to really say, can we prove out what's happening in the supply chain? Are there any issues going on around the product that we sourced? Are there any contaminants used, those type of things? And then there's, of course, really important things happening in the world that we want to make sure that there's forest protection actions taken and that we're not violating any human rights. And as we see the development of sustainability as a theme in what we do to market, we also see it as an opportunity to say, could this be a platform potentially where others can co-invest on? And this leans a little bit to what Brian was alluding to. Can we leverage open source technology like blockchain to connect others to that industry? So that's a little bit what we're doing. I'm going to break it down maybe for a practical example here. Next slide, please. So think about the cocoa supply chain. At the end of the day, cocoa supply chain is where we have most of the sourcing happens in West Africa. That's for people unfamiliar with the territory is Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Cameroon. And then we do some of that in Asia as well, like Indonesia. And then there is Brazil and Ecuador, which are specific territories also because they're kind of along the equator. And in those regions, we see farmers that actually trade with buying stations, which we call cooperatives, because they're kind of interconnected. And then we move the goods through the supply chain where we store them locally, and then we process them to a degree locally, and then we export them around the globe or to a region for further processing. That export sometimes happens directly to customers, and sometimes that stays with us. The big thing is here that you see a multitude of steps, and the diversity of the steps that are actually getting to a very granular level, because we're getting to a bean level here as an example. We really want to make sure that we can quantify the amount of beans going into a bag, for example, but also being able to track the bag through that supply chain. If you like to, please click on the next slide. You can see that the example here is that as we bring up the tiles again, there are 2 key elements in this particular screenshot I took. And I think one of the graphics just dropped, that's okay. Oh, there we go. Is that for our supply chain and grievances piece, we now have data available thanks to all of the initiatives that we invested in, but also the capabilities that allow us in this very slimmed down example here to really look at what is happening in our supply chain. So you're looking at a particular crop year, a fake customer because we called them Acme Incorporated in this example. But you can see the volume that we sourced, and we can see from which farm and farmer it came from. And more importantly, therefore, we can actually connect this to the customer to which we ship this to, and we can track other areas. And now that we have these layers of data available to us, to our businesses, we can say, hey, what's happening in the area of forest protection or human rights? Because this is essentially a visualization of those first 2, but you can imagine we have visuals available to us that can do the other part. And the sustainability as a service is really where we're thinking ahead, where we're leveraging new technologies to think things like the certification. So what if we can create an open industry certification that is beyond Cargill, but something really tailored by others that is digitized so that you can really prove things. Shared audit management, so that not only Cargill has to go there, but others can also validate and participate there openly. And that you have forms of co-investment potentially. So I think in summary, I think sustainability is more urgent than ever. And I think with digitalization, we're making things more transparent. We're really able to prove things, and it opens the doors for others to participate, which I think is really important in this particular industry. So with that said, I think my 5 minutes are up. So I really want to thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit about what Cargill is doing. And again, it's one example in one particular supply chain. We're doing many things. But I'm excited to see that these things are really materializing and changing the way we do business. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bore. I appreciate that. You're welcome to take off your mic and webcam, and we will invite Greg Montello from New Balance to step in. And the floor is yours.
So thanks for having me, and welcome everybody to the New Balance 3D printing lab. As you can see, I'm actually presenting here. I don't really have slides. I'm going to do more of a show and tell talk about where we're going in terms of sustainable or innovation practices that use a digital platform. And I just want to preference, I'm not an expert in 3D printing. I certainly my teams work on the actual substrates that we utilize to 3D print components, but you know, when it comes to the metrics and the design of these models, that's another organization. So I'll try to keep it pretty quick. But I want to start off real quick. You know, this is a different perspective, as you know, we're a consumer products company. Obviously, we make footwear, athletic footwear, and an athletic apparel. So I just wanted to quickly just talk about New Balance's kind of our digital ambition. Over the last year, we've talked a lot about this digital ambition as a brand and how it's going to guide New Balance's investments in years to come to like drive the growth that we want to see from our consumers. So a couple of weeks ago, we actually launched our new digital flagship. And when I say flagship, I say our website essentially, because we're trying to really control, we're looking at this like fundamental shift from wholesale-led business to direct-to-consumer led approaches, which most of you who are consumers are probably more aware of direct-to-consumer sales channels. And as New Balance grows, we're really looking at how do we generate higher volumes of quality data to get those consumer insights so we can drive fast, agile product and business decisions, right? So we're trying to collect data and make better decisions. So as we look from a financial perspective, how the DTC model is shifting higher margin business for us, you know, we're doing that through, that's like one way from a business perspective that we're looking at enhancing our digital enabling technologies. So from a 3D printing scenario, right? New Balance is, you know, a global company. We have facilities all over the world that produce our products. But here in Massachusetts, and specifically in our Lawrence facility where I am today, you know, we do 3D printing and we do some 3D printing components for footwear. So when the pandemic hit, we actually had to shut down our footwear production in the Lawrence factory. So we were trying to utilize our domestic manufacturing capability to support, you know, the PPE market for our healthcare workers. So when we started doing this, we started looking at how do we use 3D printing to, you know, help make PPE, face masks particularly. So I have a couple examples. So, you know, when we started looking at, you know, making face masks, right, we had to come up with digital designs, right? So we had to come up with concepts on how we would make a face mask in different designs utilizing essentially footwear materials. So all of the materials that we used in the production of the face mask actually was, you know, we were actually utilizing materials that we had in hand, right? And so to me, that's a sustainable story. We weren't trying to go outside of our existing supply chain, but we wanted to utilize those domestic partners that had excess stock, or if we had leftover stock, to go into production for PPE. So that was a big win for us to be able to come up with a new product and concept through digital design and using existing materials. And then what we started doing for 3D printing is we 3D printed these little head extenders, right? So we found out that, you know, not all these masks fit people. So we created a 3D printing of a strap extender. So these little gadgets were printed right here, and we started, you know, offering these to our healthcare industry with the masks as well. And then other things that we started to do, we made these little, you know, these little COVID door openers, right? So no one wanted to touch anything during the early phases of COVID because we didn't know what the, you know, how things were being transmitted. So we 3D printed some things that you would, you know, open doors and press buttons with. So we were really trying to think outside the box of how do we do different things with 3D printing. But more traditionally, what I want to talk about was from a chemistry standpoint is where do we go from? So when we first started looking at 3D printing substrates, it was like a nylon-based material, really heavy, you know, nothing, you know, really performance related. New Balance is really a performance first company. So when you look at how this midsole compound performed, it wasn't that great, but it was an innovative idea that we took from data to design concepts and 3D printed something. So as we started with something like this, we started to evolve, making a shoe. The shoe is 100% made in the United States. We had a 3D printed heel material. So we went from a nylon-based chemical 3D printing substrate to a TPU substrate. So we advanced, once again, looking at, practical solutions and coming up with different ways to utilize chemistry through the 3D printing, through our 3D printing design. And then as we get more advanced, we started looking at how do we 3D print, soles for soccer cleats, and then, doing stuff for 3D printing of, some of our Olympic athletes, track spike beds and stuff like that. So as we continue to advance like different substrates and how they're applied to footwear, we continue to go down that journey. So the other thing I really want to talk about quickly is from a footwear design concept, it takes 18 months from concept to commercialization to produce a shoe. And with that, we realized we were producing a lot of samples, right? And once again, this is leading into like, how does a digital platform reduce waste? And in our case, we started looking at these new 3D modeling technologies that at least the design teams do, so they can create these really textured, really robust renderings of footwear now, and instead of actually making a sample in a sample room at a factory, right? So that's one way where we've carried on these 3D, basically it's a Modo design technology that the design and the development teams can rely on instead of a factory making thousands and thousands of samples. And then sometimes we disregard many styles that never go to production. So we're looking at digital concepts to reduce waste in that area. And another thing I really want to touch on quickly from a purely chemistry standpoint, as we collaborate with different organizations, specifically ZDHC, they've built essentially a chemical database, right? So once again, using digital enabling technology to build a system of chemistries that are in conformance with the ZDHC MRSL chemical requirements. So I wanted to try to tie in like, we do some cool things in 3D printing. We try to utilize our domestic manufacturing, but from my end, where do we look at resources, right, from a digital perspective? And we do that through a lot of collaborative work with chemical companies, third-party assessors, that once again, they're never seeing anything physically. These are all done through a digital system where we evaluate chemistry and then apply a certain level of certification and create a network and a portfolio of safer chemistry. So that's really all I had to share. So I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate it. If Brian and Bore would like to share their webcams and mics, we can, and everybody get on. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. We will take a few minutes here for Q&A. Again, I'll take this moment to recommend that if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to enter them anytime you wish in the questions box, and we'll do our best to get to them. So thank you very, very much for all of you. And again, bringing in different perspectives, which is really great today. Just because we've already just come off a 3D printing printing conversation, I'm going to dive into that first, but we'll open it up as well. So the first question is really about the opportunity for green chemistry advances due to the advancement of 3D printing. So Greg, have you seen any, or do you foresee any advancements in materials because of the acceleration of 3D printing into different applications?
Yeah, absolutely. We've already seen that in some of the shoes that I kind of demonstrated. When it was really trial and error at first, like really utilizing some of the chemicals that were provided to us. Some of those chemistries weren't typically used in footwear products before, right? These were 3D printing substrates that were used in the medical field or other industries, but no one was really starting this journey of 3D printing. So once again, we started with like a very basic nylon-based substrate. And as we looked at some other chemistries, we actually found out there were some chemistries that had bad stuff in it and that we couldn't use it in 3D printing for footwear, because once again, those substrates were really designed for other industries. So, working with the chemical companies that supply substrates for 3D printing, we're able to basically weed out, more hazardous chemistry out of the formulation into something that's more suitable for a consumer wearing, a footwear product on their foot. So, I think there's so much unknown out there that there's still ample opportunity to kind of look at how we're going to apply 3D printing. And, New Balance has made a significant investment in 3D printing, in which we'll grow that capacity and look at how we can expand domestic manufacturing utilizing different designs and concepts. So it's definitely happening every day.
Great, thank you. Others? Brian, Bore, do you have any comments to add on that?
I was just thinking about one of the opportunities that I think 3D printing helps with, as well as digitalization as a whole, is sort of the prototyping process, right? As a whole, which you were showing, Greg, like lots of different ways in which you can do that, how you can use less materials to try different ways of doing things and perhaps actually reduce not only time to market, but also the amount of material you use. And also through that, I think there's a discovery process, right, of different types of materials that play into how a 3D printer can work, because it gives us a different way of interacting with the materials. And so things like multi-material design, multi-material structures, those type of things start to become more accessible because of 3D printing, and you can take a different approach, which is more sustainable than perhaps was harder to do in the past.
Yeah, I think the 3D printing in the food industry is super interesting because you can see a lot of these concepts materializing around, for example, a 3D printed burger and at the same time being cooked as it's printed, right? And we have a few of these experiments going on in different product lines that we have. And we do the same for chocolate, as I was talking to that earlier product line example, where you can think about consumers going to the bakeries and then having customized products literally built in front of them. And if you can supply the right ingredients and materials that allow you to really think about it in a new concept and actually at the same time integrate even further in your supply chain, it's a win-win, right? It creates transparency, it creates customer needs visibility, and it allows a different point of sale that we're traditionally used to as a Cargill. So I think the application of 3D printing in food is huge, and we're exploring a lot of what that means also for raw materials and processing side.
Excellent, thank you all. Let's go on to another question, totally switching gears here. Sorry, no more 3D printing for the moment. Ingredient transparency. So Bora, you touched on this, and actually you probably all in some way really touched on it. But when we look at sustainability, and even the GC3 has a project on this right now, ingredient transparency through the supply chain is a real challenge. People for the opportunity to share hazard information, composition, et cetera, so people downstream can make more informed decisions and also be more transparent as a whole. So we find that intellectual property tends to be a challenge in terms of that communication, no question. But given what you've seen in the advancements in digitalization for other areas of transparency and traceability, do you see any possibilities for digitalization to be playing a role to improve the or to facilitate ingredient transparency?
Yeah, I think absolutely. We have a use case that we're actually currently exploring in the sense of what does food specification management look like, and part of that specification is recipe, and of course then you get to a very granular level of like what are the ingredients that are part of that build. And I think there's a degree where, I mean, this is the reality that you have a commercial element that makes your product unique, and there's certain sensitivity around that. At the same time, you want to be as transparent of where that's coming from. I think where digitalization helps is that you can actually build certain barriers without, and being open about that, and at the same time actually connect things where other people don't have access, where they didn't have access before. So I think the use case around this specific example is actually very hot, very relevant to us, because we have a lot of customers asking for that clarification. We're at the moment really stretching our thought process of what that could look like and what kind of elements we could share beyond the point that we're already sharing today.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, maybe an additional thought there too is that I think there are ways in which you can technologically put up barriers within a chain, and I'm not referring to a blockchain, but any chain, right? Where you can actually share parts of the data or not other parts of the data to make it maybe more appealing for us to share the type of data that's impactful and necessary, but also protects the pieces that we need to protect in order to be ongoing commercial entities. So I think there are technical solutions already out there that we're seeing that can do this. But I also think there needs to be sort of a discrimination on our part about what really is important data and what is maybe not as important data. And I don't mean it's not valuable. I mean, we just need to start to shift our mindset a little bit about where the line for IP can be drawn. As an example of this, we actually just this year searched through our collection of molecules and released a set of active ingredients out to academia that we thought could have efficacy to fight COVID-19. Right, and that was something that we knew we had because we've been around for 150 plus years, but we knew that also would have greater value, probably not in our hands. It's not necessarily an area that we work in per se, in active ingredients, at least in the pharma space, and we can give that out, right? And so that information can be shared because we did that active discrimination first to figure out what is really valuable to us and what is not, and how can we help to serve something that's a little more sustainable and ongoing.
Great example. All right, well, thank you. I think this is honestly a conversation that will probably be touched on perhaps later today, as well as maybe even beyond today. So thank you. All right, and then one more question, and then I think just one more question, then we'll skip to additional speakers. This one comes in from the group as well. In transition from traditional R&D or chemistry to more interdisciplinary teams, how have you learned to integrate this broader expertise and new set of tools into, from digitalization?
Well, I guess since I said I was part of, oh, go ahead, Greg. I'll come after you.
I was just going to say, so yeah, I mean, that certainly helped in our world because not everybody is a chemist and a lot of people don't want to be chemists. So the whole digital foundation it helps us learn the design process. Like when you look at creating a mid-sol compound, it's a very geometric design practice. And, we might not be designing molecules, but we're certainly working with our material suppliers to help compound different softness and durometers of these different compounds. And that's all done digitally, right? So you translate a design on how you want something to function in a shoe, and then we actually can take that to our compounders, our EVA rubber compounders in Asia, and really work with them to just say, okay, these are the actual chemical ingredients that we need to get to this, softness or hardness or whatever. So that was something that, I've learned at New Balance from, being very kind of having blinders on and looking at being in factories and watching all these chemical ingredients go into a vat and produce molds and everything, versus now we're seeing this from, a CAD design to the developers using 3D modeling and how they want something to perform. And then we can take that all the way to, actual commercialization and work with a factory to run trials and make it a better performing product. So.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I think that digitalization creates sort of a bridge, right? I think Greg's story actually, in the way that we think about how things move between labs, even within our own company, and then also as you start to go out between supplier and provider, for example, I think are an interesting story. And I think that's the enablement, right? The technology has become, I don't want to say simpler, but it has become more readily available for people to get. And for us to use to share things in a richer way, right? Beyond email, that I could just email it to you, but rather an interactive way. Could we get together and actually work simultaneously in a 3D environment? That's actually starting to happen now, right? Which I think is really promising. But I think it's also about sort of a mindset change, right? People have to think that actually we get more value out of working across borders than we do probably within our silos. Certainly, maybe you can't get as deep because that's part of the reason maybe you are siloed, but you actually can gain far more, I think, by reaching out across those boundaries. And that's what digitalization starts to do. And it's, I think, generically been referred to in many cases as democratization of that capability.
Yeah, I really like what Brian just said there. I think one small add I'll have, and I know we're coming up on time, I think from, the connection of digitalization really compresses also the timelines potentially, because you get more collective and you break barriers not only globally, but also from a department level, right? I think you get more people honed in into meetings where in the past you would have to travel or do the physical part. But at the same time, I think there's an element of digitalization around that is missing, and that is that you can also not build at the speed of trust that you usually do physically in the room. So from a world that is radically digitalized thanks due to the pandemic, I would also say like the human interaction aspect is super important as well, because it also actually accelerates the digitalization, because if you can't translate non-verbal communication, which is a lot of things, it makes it really hard to operate effectively and with trust as well, because these departments that haven't never connected before now have all of a sudden need to connect, and there might be different agendas involved in a good way, but I only meant it in a positive way, but I think that's an element what we always keep in mind when we work this way.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it. At this point, I will ask you to turn off your webcams and mics, and we will invite you back up later in the session to have a more thorough discussion as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jill Becker from Cobotics, and the following presentation after that is from Codexis. Again, both of these are really focusing more on the technologies that they are able to implement as well. So let's turn it over to Jill.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jill Becker. My apologies, my webcam is not working, but regardless, I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about Cobotics. Our tagline is materials for tomorrow today, and that's to instill in you the sense of urgency that we need better chemicals, better materials in order to solve the world's most urgent problems. Next slide, please. So the problem really is that R&D is not that productive. It costs a lot. Chemical material companies, they're very good at what they do, large scale production and chemical material sales, but it can take 10 to 15 years to bring a new chemical into an end product manufacturer. There's a lot of failure, and it's costly, it's too slow, and the success rate is too low. So this is where we come in as Cobotics. Next slide, please. So we reinvented how to invent. What you're looking at in the circle in the center is the scientific method, but instead of a PhD dreaming up a new material, and I'm not knocking basic research, I actually myself have a PhD in chemistry, we now have a suite of material informatics tools that dreams up what chemicals you should be making with the properties of interest. Now, that's all well and good, but you can dream anything up. You at some point have to make it. The AI then thinks about how to make it, and our robots make the top candidates. Another robotic suite tests those chemicals just like a chemist would. And what are you testing for? You're testing that you made what you said you're going to make, and does it have the properties of interest? And you're left with an actual chemical ready for prototyping. This is 21st century technology here already. We have multiple, we call it Chemos tools, so chemical operating system, that can be used standalone or together in order to come up with chemical materials solutions faster at a cheaper cost. Next slide, please. So just a few examples, just to highlight two of the tools. With Company X, it's a chemical company, and as you might know, if you want to know how a chemical behaves, you have to make it. So this company had dreamt up 2,300 possible chemicals to use with inside of cars, and we were able to rank all 2,300 with 3 properties of interest: viscosity, boiling point, and vapor pressure. We did that in 3 months, saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. They made the top 4, and it showed us that our prediction was really accurate. We did this with a tool that we call property prediction of chemicals, so not very innovative. But I'm skipping over Company Y right now. Since we have such a strong prediction, we decided to ask the software to look for a needle in the haystack. So we uploaded more than 7 million commercially available chemicals into our software, and we asked it to find a new novel electrochromic material for smart window applications, and it did that. and we patented it. So what I'm saying is we can patent and find new use cases in other companies' structure case IP. And that's pretty impressive, but the software is set up to learn. So when it understood what the winner was, it dreamt up a new library of candidates that no one had ever seen before, where we own both the use case and the structure case IP. Very same tool. And then separately, we also have come up with a tool that's a synthetic route prediction tool, both forwards and backwards. Backwards is retrosynthesis. You have the end, and you're asking how it's best made. And we recently did a partnership with a big oil and natural gas company to come up with a cost-efficient way to make a green monomer. So all these are very sustainable success use cases. We, of course, have others, but within 5 minutes, this is what I wanted to talk about. Next slide, please. So what we do is we help people create chemistry faster at a reduced cost. We also focus heavily on formulations and compounding. This is really to help scientists achieve their goals and their tasks faster. We help everywhere from the configuration. In the center, the AI makes a lot of the decisions, and then it actually even cues the next sets of experiments. As you saw in that circle again, we call that not only our closed loop platform, but we also call it our self-driving lab, which we have built out and recently moved to a new location that we can control better during times of COVID. Next slide, please. We also focus heavily on green molecules, not just making non-toxic, environmentally friendly specialty and fine chemicals, but also starting from green feedstocks like cellulose, lignin, and alginate in order to we're heavily focused also on pigments and colorants, so eco-friendly colorants, eco-friendly optical brighteners, and things like that. I think my time is up, so last slide. I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to talk a little bit, and I look forward to our discussion.
Actually, thank you so much, Jill. We really appreciate it. And now we are going to take a moment and switch to David Entwistle with Codexis, and we're just switching the slides here. When you get all set, once you present, if you could put it in presentation mode and turn on your mic, you're good to go. Thank you.
Can you see and hear me?
I just need it in presentation mode, full screen.
How's that?
Perfect.
Can you see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So thank you. Let me just sort of move this box a little so I can see what's going on. Okay, so I've got some parallels in what I'm about to talk about to what the previous speaker just discussed. So what Codexis is and what we do, we're a company that engineers high performance enzymes for meaningful challenges. It's like our goal, but our mission statement really is we do that. We engineering these enzymes so we can, our clients can apply them for projects where we're really aiming to improve the health of the planet and its inhabitants. So over the last few years, we've engineered enzymes and proteins for companies that have had really very meaningful impact on their products. So I put on this slide kind of 4 areas that we've been involved with. I think we're predominantly most well known in pharmaceutical manufacturing, engineering enzymes that are catalysts to do chemical reactions. And on this particular slide, I've mentioned that our enzyme is used by Merck to produce the majority of their world supply of Januvia, their diabetes drug. More recently, we're actually using our enzymes as the therapeutic themselves in enzyme replacement therapy. So really targeting some very rare diseases that are very, very nasty, have very sort of severe implications for patients, limited diet for the rest of their life. Earlier on we heard about food manufacturing, how that needs to be sustainable, and the more and more consumers are looking for what is a natural label, more natural ways of processing. And enzyme processing has been used in food manufacturing for thousands of years, but what we can do is really take that to the next level, because we can design and really tailor and engineer those enzyme catalysts to do what we want. Another area, the last one on this slide, that I won't talk about, but is very relevant in today's pandemic world, is enzymes are used in all aspects of DNA sequencing, and diagnostic tests. So there are enzymes that are doing reactions that are not really very advanced, that are close to wild type, that really could benefit from engineering. So maybe if there aren't a lot of chemists in the audience, we can just say, what is a protein or what is an enzyme? An enzyme is a collection of amino acids, a polymer of amino acids. And so we have a challenge. I need to describe how we use digital technologies. I really need to just describe it really in 2 minutes what we do. Here is a picture of an enzyme, about 300 amino acids. This is the kind of shape that it forms. And the graphics up here, if we have a 300 amino acid sequence with 20 potential amino acids at each one, there's an astronomically large number of combinations that sequence can take. That means you can't get lucky. You can't just pick one sequence out of this and get lucky. So you have to have a way to navigate what we call the sequence space. So what we've got here is a simple representation. Here is, let's call it our activity, the property we want to increase. And we have 2 axes here representing 2 mutations on this, 2 positions on this protein chain. And what we actually have are 300 axes here. But very conceptually, what we need to do is find an enzyme that has some property that we desire to start with. And we've got, if we use this kind of mountain analogy, we're at a base camp here. And what we do is we make single mutations at this point, and we gradually accumulate those mutations and get better and better and go from base camp to mid camp, ascending to the summit. So that's a very, very simple explanation of what we do. And this can be any trait: activity, selectivity, thermostability, toleration of solvents, you name it. If you can measure it, you can usually improve against it. So this is how directed evolution works. This is the basis of the technology Francis Arnold, co-shared the Nobel Prize for in 2018. So where does the digitalization come in? So this, in some ways, it might not look the same, but it's kind of similar to Kibartik's circle as well. It's the kind of the scientific method, but there's maybe a little bit more to it here. So what we're going to do, what we're going to start off with, here's our starting protein, and this is actually encoded for by DNA, by a gene. And so what we have to do is we have to make a library of DNA. And what we do is we have 2 technologies here to find the starting enzyme. We have alignment software and searching in known homologs, known databases of enzymes. This is proprietary internal software. And also, once we've got once we know that the position on the amino acid we want to, on the protein we want to engineer, we need to convert that into a nucleotide sequence, into DNA. And so we've just got one push software we've developed to make this easier for our scientists to do that. And that order goes directly to the gene manufacturer. So there's no kind of human intervention. We design it, we push a button, and that order goes directly to the gene vendor. And we then get those genes back maybe the next day or 2 days later. So we have our genes. We need to put those into an organism. So we're not making our enzymes in a chemical factory. We're fermenting them. We're using an organism, usually E. coli. And what we do is we generate a lot of data here. We have everything barcoded. We have things barcoded in a physical sense on the plates and in a DNA sense. And we need a comprehensive data management system. A harvester is called, that takes all our sequence data and all our activity data. The next part is the screening. We have here again, we have to screen, and we also have to sequence. And we use next generation sequencing. We use internal software again to take those DNA sequences and push that into our harvester database. To date, we have close to 900,000 amino acid sequences correlated with DNA sequences, correlated with activity data on enzymes that we've screened. And finally, really the most important part here is once we've got this and that, once we've got all this data, we need to analyze this. And what we're looking for is to determine, this little graph here is supposed to depict mutations on an amino acid. We've got to work out which ones are beneficial, which ones are deleterious. And we have sort of machine learning algorithms and some other algorithms that really help us deconvolute this data. And then the next step is to then couple that and use next generation software to really couple, because we're all talking about linear sequence here, is to fold in the shape of the molecules to make some predictions based on locations of molecules close to each other. So really this, what I'm not trying to get into detail, but just so you can see there is software and digitalization at every point in this process. There are other groups, the Arnold group looking at AI, and the Baker Lab looking at sort of de novo enzyme design, to try and push this to make this go faster. But what we do is all this software helps us go around this iterative cycle faster and faster. And in evolution terms, that means we get more generations in, and we can make better enzymes at the end of it. So I'd like to just close. I just want to show you two. Again, I'm a chemist. I can't have a presentation and not show some structures. These are two client compounds that have been recently sort of put into the public domain. The one on the left, elastravir, is a HIV drug produced by Merck, and this is made completely biocatalytically using a 9-enzyme cascade. 5 of those enzymes are highly engineered, that we engineered in collaboration with Merck. And this was their route from the beginning. They have not made bulk material of this by more traditional synthetic means. And the other one, relative in the food space, is this rhodiosidine, and this is present in only a minute quantity in the stevia plant leaf. It's a high-intensity sweetener, about 400 times sweeter than sucrose, with a much better taste profile. And we engineered a 3-enzyme cascade to add additional sugars to the most predominant glycoside present in the leaf to produce this material, which Tate and Lyle have now commercialized. So these are just 2 examples, one in pharma, one in food. We have many more we could discuss in pharma, but I just wanted to show this other one in food, because to show that this technology really is agnostic to the vertical that we apply it in. And that is everything. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, David. I really appreciate that. If you could stay on screen, we will ask Jill to join us, and I will as well. And apologies, Jill is with us in audio, but not in picture, but she is here. So we'll take a few minutes for a Q&A, and then we will have everybody else join us in the final Q&A. So just starting out, oh, and I should mention, my apologies, I didn't mention this earlier. Cubotics is a new member of the GC3 Startup Network, so thank you. And Codexis is not currently, but is a Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Award winner previously, and I just thought when I recognized that, I said, you know what? Yeah, right, multiple. And BASF and Cargill are as well. So just wanted to recognize that these technologies certainly have been recognized. So why don't we go into some Q&A? First one, along those green chemistry lines of thought. And I think this really goes out to both of you. If you could elaborate further on the tools that you use to predict toxicity of the chemicals being modeled. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, we're in the process of writing the provisional, so I can't speak about that right now so much, but it's very similar with how we predict other things. You just need real data as well in terms of the feedback in the live studies, right? That's a very important data point to have as well.
In the therapeutic protein space, when you have injected proteins, necessarily toxicity, but the immunogenic response is something that is rather difficult. Essentially, you end up having to do like human studies to work it out. But there are sort of computational methods where you look for sort of TEMRs for motifs that are known to cause allergenicity. So there are tools that you can use to kind of de-risk the proteins when you're going to be injecting them. But ultimately, it comes down to testing.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go down to deciding which direction I want to go with these questions. All right, so as what I'll call a technology provider, and that's really honestly a generic term here, what challenges have you faced with market introduction or even market expansion? Certainly, I know Codexis has done a lot in certain segments, but clearly you're expanding into food and ag and others. So, and similar question, obviously, Cubotics can answer the same one. What challenges have you faced?
I can go first if that's okay.
Sure.
So again, my experience in the pharma sector is risk averseness. So once a route to make an API is kind of, I wouldn't say set, but it's gone through phase 1 and phase 2, if that has used a different technology, there is often a reluctance to change because that might change the impurity profile, means that toxicology might have to be rerun. So any change in any technology, and it doesn't have to be biocatalysis, is always, weighed against the risk of what you're going to do to that profile. If there is a huge upside in either being able to produce that compound or more efficiently, cheaper, or more sustainably, then that's more likely to happen. But if the challenging technology to the incumbent technology is just as good, there is no reason to change. So in pharma, that is one of the biggest things is incumbency and an acceptance of chemists like me, maybe slightly more dyed in the wool, who really need to accept that there are that biocatalysis is not cheating. It's you just want to choose the best catalyst to do what you want. So I give the other speaker a chance to talk. Jill.
I think, why would anyone ever risk their supply chain on a new material, right? There's only 3 reasons why anyone would change. One is it has to be at least 15% cheaper. 2 is it has to be better somehow, longer lasting. Let's say a better blue OLED emitter that has a better, somehow isn't so sensitive to moisture or water and oxygen. And then the last that we're seeing is because of the regulations around the world, less so with the EPA under Trump in the last 4 years, but there's been a lot of chemicals that were outlawed that are driving change and innovation is costly, and a lot of for-profit companies are driven to create shareholder value, so they don't want to invest too much in tomorrow's innovation. And I think everyone can feel the need that the digital revolution is here, especially in times of COVID. So we have a lot of inbound requests to anything from the beauty industry to food, and pharma is also knocking on our door. But as a small startup with limited funds, we just closed our Series A. We can't do everything overnight. So part of the problem is what buckets do we play in now? We're also looking at spinning out other companies that can then dedicate themselves to the certain verticals. One of the ones we're looking to do is, I call it just as a placeholder right now, Foundation Pharma, that would use the tools of cobotics, but specifically for small drug discovery. So I think as a startup, you need to really focus. And inside our company, we use a saying called master the small. I know that doesn't sound very sexy, but we want to be really, really good at what we're really good at and not stretch ourselves too thin. But a lot of the tools are agnostic to the types of chemicals. And David, I love this last slide that you showed in your talk. I do believe that the algorithms can be used in other industries. But again, 17 people, I have to focus. Otherwise, as a VC-backed CEO, I'll get fired.
Yeah, I can follow up with an example as well. You said about things having to be cheaper. Palm oil fatty alcohol is a good example. We developed a process to make a fatty alcohol completely in vitro. You just put in sugar and the organism, and so you don't have to deforest places. And it just didn't go anywhere in the market because it was more expensive than cutting down all the trees. So people sometimes talk a good game that they want to be sustainable, but when it comes down to it, they're not willing to pay for it. So we have a few examples there where you just can't drive the cost low enough to cutting down a tree, which is a shame.
Yeah, it's all about the Benjamins.
Mm.
All right, so let's dive into collaborations, because that sometimes there's shared risk there, shared funds. When you look at collaborations, do you usually do one-on-one collaborations? Are you looking at larger collaboratives and within a sector, or do you tend to expand across the value chain?
You wanna go first, Jim?
All of the above for us, all of the above.
Our model is definitely more solutions based. So we usually have a client will approach us with a very specific ask, and that ask can be very knowledgeable, knowing that they want to do exactly this, or it can be, I want to, I want to be able to use biocatalysis to do something, or does it add value to find out how that works? So, but with us, it is very much usually on a direct customer basis. And that's not to say it couldn't be, a broader collaborative model with a consortium, but that's in my experience the last 8 years, that's how it's worked.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. What I'd like to do is invite Brian, Bore, and Greg to rejoin us. If you could turn on your webcams and mics. We will dive into exploring these conversations together. Almost there, right? 1, 2. Greg's there. Yep, we got everybody, right? I think so. All right, well, thank you, everybody. So you've had a chance to hear all the presentations now. I'll start with a question and then we'll kind of explore from there. Again, because we just had some of these technology companies on, I just wanted to ask for collective input on what are the opportunities or challenges with exploring collaborations with startups, because there's so many new technologies coming forward in this field. Do you find that, are there any best practices that you've learned in terms of either the interaction or engagement?
I can maybe start off. I find that the one thing that we always have a very big conversation on is IP. That virtually always comes down to IP, because we're a provider, and the client either wants to control that IP. But I suppose for our particular technology, what isn't necessarily obvious is that one enzyme class, it builds on the shoulders of another. If we have to go around that cycle from scratch every time, no one benefits. So by us having IP where we can build on the shoulders and engineer and make a family of things that can serve other markets, that IP model is crucial for us. And explaining that to clients, so they understand that we're not just trying to go and sell the same enzyme we're selling to them to someone else, is a key hurdle that we have at many stages.
Yeah, we can't, the way we circumvent the IP thing is we focus on the deliverables. What are the specific deliverables? And then usually the tech, of course, that we provide, and the nice thing too is we can generate our own data in most cases, so customers don't have to share their data with us, which also is sometimes nice, because their data, it's like, your newborn, you think it's beautiful, but nobody else does. And sometimes there's bias in there or redundancy, and we have to supplement it anyways, because to do machine learning, you need at least 250,000 pieces of data, and most companies don't have that much data for the specific thing that they're trying to address. So we just make it. And so the lines become very clear. When we do come up with a lot of times we can also do improvements, so there's no transfer of IP. But for some of the things that are IP, it's either shared, or the larger the company, the older the company, the more, it's a risk-reward ratio, right? Who wants to have what risk for what reward? We sometimes do IP with royalties off of top-line revenue.
All right, thank you. What about Brian, Bore, Greg, any thoughts on this in terms of your interactions?
The biggest challenge that we would probably see is scale. It's working with, smaller companies that offer a certain solution or a certain, bio-based material or something that certainly has some elements that could, increase performance or help with, increasing, some of our goals for bio-based materials and certain footwear products. But it always comes down to the company's ability to scale. So when we start talking about millions of pairs of shoes or something of that nature, we get lost pretty quickly in its ability to try to go from a a small startup to, having manufacturing entities to support our businesses in Asia and around the world. It just, sometimes the conversation is, it's pretty quick because they just don't have the ability to source areas where we would need it to be, where we have manufacturing happening. So it's really a question of scale, their ability to scale quickly and effectively, and have the right performance attributes as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's interesting. I've been on both sides of this argument, right? I've been the company that's trying to scale, and I've been part of the company that's expecting scale. And it's a tough story, right? Both ways. Because I think Jill said it very nicely, is they're trying to focus on exactly what they're good at and how to do that, and do that well. And I think that's important, and you need to acknowledge that when you're working with startups, and maybe when it comes to scale, which is also, I think, a concern for us, you can think about ways in which you can partner a little more intimately to help with scale, because, for example, BASF has the ability to scale, depending, right? And so maybe that's one way that you can help with a collaboration like that. But that's certainly, I think, a challenge for working with small. But we also can't have our cake and eat it too, to be frank. We can't expect the sort of agile company because they're small and they've got a great idea and a small team that can go fast, and then also demand that they scale. So somewhere we have to figure out how to balance that, I think, as good partners in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think
sorry, go ahead.
I guess I just wanted to add on top of, when we talk about scale, we as a company have to decide, what story are we trying to tell as well? Because, New Balance is we're an athletic brand with, some of the most famous athlete assets. We're good at storytelling. So sustainability certainly comes into that category, and when we want to tell a story. So when you talk about scale, we could partner with a bio-based resin company and produce a midsole unit that incorporates 30 or 40% of this resin for one style, right? But once that style has come and gone, your story goes away. So you want to tell a story of, like, we'll incorporate 5% of this bio-based resin across 20 different styles and 10 million pairs of shoes, versus trying to build a story around one particular style that might be biodegradable or whatever you're trying to say. It's just, what are you trying to tell, and how do you want to utilize that technology across all of your platforms, whether it's running or basketball or whatever. It's just how you portraying that story to a consumer, if you want to share it. So
yeah, I think what Greg and Brian touched on, the side of scale for what we're also seeing. We have a platform outside which is known as Techstars, where we leverage startups to give them an environment to scale and do things. But at the same time, the thing I'll add to the scale side of the organization, where you're sitting on the Cargill side, is our business ready to absorb this new tech and this new startup as well and support it, right? It's when you have something like a robot driving through a cornfield to do, soil sampling, which sounds really cool and awesome, but then you have, I would say, a little bit more traditional folk, internal, like doing the day-to-day stuff, and they're like, oh, how are we going to deal with that? So the absorption of the new tech and the startup into a more traditional corporation, or a big, slow corporation, maybe that's a better way of saying it, is I think then the next challenge.
Yeah.
I think everybody connected that one. Okay. So let's expand this conversation a little bit further and think ahead. If we were sitting here tasked with developing a list of grand challenges, as you've seen for grand challenges for sustainability and other things, but if we were looking at the grand challenges for digitalization, for sustainable innovation, what do you think those challenges are? What are the hurdles that are limiting advancement right now, or that may limit advancement?
Part of it, Julie, is the ability of your workforce to learn the technology. We've certainly, and I might not see it on my side as much as how people develop shoes today is much different than how people develop shoes 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? So as these technologies advance, You're not just sketching a shoe on a napkin anymore. There's a lot of, some of these 3D technologies, that requires a certain level of training that, some traditional designers have never experienced. So that's certainly something that we see in some areas where we've basically taken on or created new departments that really rely on knowing the technology. I don't mind sitting in the dark, it's fine.
Could you have energy saving lab?
It's learning the technology.
I would say in our industry in particular, I showed that circle that we go around, that the we're close to being as fast to going around that as we can. We've eliminate bottlenecks as soon as we can, and we're probably most limited by the speed now that the organism grows, E. coli, and there are ways to circumvent that. So at some point, going faster won't make it any more efficient for us. And so then that's when you really get into the AI. And like I said, the predictive for proteins is, lots of people can predict a starting activity of an enzyme, and that's what the Baker Lab do very well. But to push that from a research molecule into be a commercializable catalyst still requires that pragmatic circle. And so the grand challenge there is, you push a button and you get the catalyst that you want. And I still think that's orders of magnitude of computing power and knowledge away. So that for us is the challenge about better designing more. We do what we call a semi-rational approach, but to go fully rational at the moment, we don't know enough about how things work, and we don't even have the best AI models that can help you go there. So I don't know if that leads into anything Jill wants to say about the AI as well.
Well, I think what limits innovation is humans' capacity to handle change. So, and risk. So as an entrepreneur, I, of course, don't mind risk. That's part of my job description. But when you're talking to very large companies, they don't want to risk their, billion-dollar fabs or labs on a little company that you might be working with. And I see a lot of fear too in chemists' eyes that our AI will take their jobs. And that is not what we're trying to do. We're trying to take the serendipity and those years out of the scientific process to empower them to still be creative, but really focus on better stuff that they need to be doing. Whether that's, you're automating the base bath, for those of you who don't know what that is, a chemist always must clean their glassware, to telling them how to make something better, higher yield. I mean, imagine you're a big company, you have a $1 billion chemical, and our AI helps you improve your yield by 0.02%. That's pure profit, because you're not changing anything, right? So you didn't harm any jobs. In fact, you secured the jobs because you've just made the company more profitable. But I feel human beings don't like change very much, most people. And the way you can circumvent that is by communication. And then I feel like there's a lot of distrust when it comes to science and scientific events. So people are a little bit afraid of, I think, AI and machine learning. So any ways we can humanize things like that, like nanotechnology, AI, and also speak at a level where everyone can understand these concepts, I think that will then allow humans to accept these new innovations that are coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, maybe if I could just build on that for a little bit. I think the conversation about, it's a little bit not specific to sustainability, but I think it has a tie-in, right? Is that when we think about displacement, which I think is what I hear is a theme a little bit in what Jill is saying in how people respond to this. I think the conversation hasn't shifted to augmentation, which I think was a lot of what these types of technologies can provide, right? So before I was mentioning democratization, right? So how we can make technologies more accessible to people and making it a little bit simpler for them to get. And also, frankly, if done properly, in a lot of instances, AI is behind the scenes, right? People don't know, they just get a result. You don't realize the amount of machine learning that's happening behind Google search results. You just freak out when you start typing in the next term and realize it's actually predicted what you want. So I think that's part of how we as people in the digital space have to also think about how we deliver the technology. But augmentation is hugely important to achieve the types of results that I think technologies like machine learning and other artificial intelligence techniques can actually help us to actualize, because it is about profit for sure, but it's not just about profit, right? It's about reduction of how much we can use in order to achieve the same yield, in order to maintain even current business and or increase and grow. And that is a sustainability story. So when we think about how we reduce our footprint and how we take advantage of the natural environment and the types of raw materials we need to produce these types of chemicals for people, we have to incorporate digital tools, because the incremental technologies perhaps that we've incorporated to this point haven't gotten us there. And in order to make the sort of stepwise change, we have to start to rely on digitalization to get there.
Yeah, I think the small comment I'll add, I think Jill and Brian, you're really onto something. I think the transformation and the willingness to adopt the technology if you take the example I presented on, I think the sourcing and the granularity and the impact of what we do in our raw material sourcing, I think it's very broad. You can imagine just for cocoa alone, we're doing globally 400,000 farmers. So you can note that the breadth of scale is huge. And at the same time, you want to drive that. And I think that the key element here is like, what's in it for them in that example that Jill also gave, like what's in it for a chemist to start thinking about it differently, the same way you would ask a farmer to actually provide correct data and actually do the yield analysis and actually think about utilizing the plot optimally and actually cutting down maybe a tree, which actually saves them and actually gets them more yield down the line. But these are the things that data and technology can bring together. And that allows us in turn to be more predictive and use AI and machine learning to actually see where potential threats might happen on other topics like deforestation. So I think to the degree of like what limits innovation is exactly the way I think Jill said it. It's the willingness, but the ability also to absorb change and technology in the process of what we do.
Thank you. I have barely a second to ask one more question, but we're going to get it in here. And it just means that you might have to choose who answers it. And that is, to what degree are these new digital methods of design being linked to data on health hazards associated with the chemistries in order to optimize design and health and safety? Any thoughts? Any takers?
I mean, I can, again, I'm a bit biased on the biotechnology side, but you know that the catalysts themselves, you could eat their protein, so and they're biodegradable. So, but you know that's not to say they can't. You know, there are certain detergent proteases known to be an inhalation risk. So that there's not total no risk, but definitely in those processes where you're using biocatalysts, I think the risks are potentially lower, but I still think they would require to be quantified.
So yeah, Brian.
I was going to say, I think you can also use, I mean, we can model toxicity and with enough data, right, and start to understand safety issues and whether certain formulations and or chemical structures could actually create problems. And actually, we have an example of, I won't do it, but we have an example of how we've used our supercomputer to help with that. So I think that's also a way that you can incorporate digitalization to help you predict these things prior to even going down the path of experimenting.
Yeah, we're always trying to link that up, but at the end of the day, you have to think about what toxicity really means. So in the chemical world, you're often looking at things that are called material safety data sheets. And if you look up the MSDS for sand, it looks quite toxic. And I know we've all been to the beach. So you have to take some of these with a grain of salt.
So it sounds like there may be more opportunity to explore that area as well in terms of digitalization and enabling green chemistry, perhaps. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our presenters today. You've done an amazing job, and I have to tell everyone, to tell somebody to take 5 minutes to present and then actually to do it, that's remarkable. So thank you all very, very much for sharing your expertise. And if you'd like, you're welcome to step off our webcams and our mics, and I'll turn it over to Michelle to close.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Julie, for moderating an amazing session, and thank you for the speakers who were just fabulous. We appreciate everyone joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for our collaboration series. On October 6th, we will be unveiling our new report on the relationship between green chemistry and the circular economy. This session will explore how co-optimizing green chemistry and circularity can drive sustainability forward. Then on October 8th, we will share our current work facilitating a dialogue between retailers and suppliers on ingredient transparency. The GC3 is unique in that we can bring together retailers and suppliers to collaborate and build consensus. This project on ingredient transparency is an excellent example of that work. So we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, and thanks again for joining us today.